Good.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's start. Yeah, good. So, please welcome all to this Westermark seminar. My name is Antti Tanskanen, and I have organizing this seminar series with Nerkka Danielspakka, who is over there. And the seminar is named after Edward Westermark, who was a founding father of Finnish sociology and also one of the first evolutionary sociologists in the world. And Westermark's scientific work was a century ahead of its time. And the idea of this Westermark seminar is to bring together scholars from different disciplines and who are interested in evolutionary theory. And I think our keynote speaker today represents well the legacy of Westermark. And now Anna Rucher will present the keynote speaker.
Yes, thank you. This is really an honor. I suggested to a young student of social psychology to come to listen to Robert Trivers, and after some hours he texted me, "Holy, this guy has written about and invented everything in Versals." And I think that is really incredible for many of us here how influential Robert Trivers has been, not only for our thinking, not only for the seminal papers he wrote in evolutionary theory and social theory, but also actually for our lives. Because once you start reading about the concept of reciprocal altruism, it's nice that you are nodding here, parental investment, parent-offspring conflict, not least, for everybody of you, if you have a parent or a child, it will change the way you think about your interactions, and many other ways. So in that sense, this combination of really creating the field of natural selection and social theory, which was to be able to put that title on a book and then it's actually full of your own stuff is amazing. Robert Trivers has been influential for me in three main ways. One is his seminal contributions to evolutionary theory, as I already mentioned. The second one is that he's also really good at providing the historical background to how your ideas emerged. So in this book, I already mentioned, he actually explains the papers, how they evolved, who inspired him, who irritated him, who provoked him, also including some the things we are not too proud about in scientific collaboration, as maybe not acknowledging somebody else for the work they have done. And I think this is very helpful, not only for sociologists to understand what you have done, but also to framing your work in the field of the history of ideas. Thirdly, Robert Trivers is also a person who is not only an academic. And I think for many of us present in this audience, that has also been an inspiration in our lives, that it is somebody who has, for instance, a long legacy of political activism. You are clearly also a human being and not just this luminous great theoretician we are in awe of. When I then asked this psychology student, so which one of all these things Robert Trivers has invented is most important for you or now struck you, he said, it's impossible to say. The first paper on reciprocal altruism is fantastic, but his latest idea on how you fool yourself in order to be able to lie to others, that is just mind-blowing. So, Robert, a warm welcome to Helsinki. And please, we look forward to hearing your lecture on self-deception.
going to lecture today on Petos ya Itzepetos. And there's a book by that title, and the publisher kindly gave me some copies that my agent never passed on to me, so I've never seen the finished version before. The book was published in 2011 and it's been translated into 11 languages, including most recently mainland Chinese and Taiwanese. It's translated into Korean as well. It's not translated into Japanese because there's a chapter on false historical narratives, and of course I use the US as an example. I always believe in starting with self-criticism. I discuss the Israeli false historical narrative. They ain't happy with that. And Japan ain't happy because I talked about their lies regarding comfort girls, as they called them, the sex slaves that they had, Korean, Chinese, Philippines, Indonesians, and so on, during World War II. Anyway, it's a great joy to be here. I've never been to Helsinki before. I arrived yesterday from Zurich. I did come to Finland 20 years ago, to Turku, and I served as an outside examiner on Virpi Luma's thesis. And that was a great pleasure as well. And I will be taking a train Sunday to Turku, and I'll lecture in Turku, and Tuesday fly back. All right, I've done my job there. So, deceit and self-deception from viruses right down to Donald Trump. That's what I want to lecture on today. So let's get rolling. Now you see here a beautiful snake, just the head of the snake. You can see his or her eyes. You can see this set of scales that go from the side of each eye back here. You can see this pattern. If it were in color, if they had taken the photo in color, this would be yellow, orange, red, and black mixed together in a pattern that mimics the coloration of a highly poisonous snake. So this looks like a poisonous snake, and it even has the shape of a snake's head, because snakes often kill prey that are much larger than they am, and so they have to have a mouth that detaches here that allows them to swallow, you know, a rat or something, or whatever the animal is that's much bigger than them, and then they'll coil up somewhere and digest it. But it's not a snake's head. It's a pupae. That is, it's a butterfly, and it's the stage between being a caterpillar when you're crawling along and when you then decide to change, metamorphose into a butterfly. And you do that by making a cocoon and then rearranging all your body so that when it opens up 2 weeks later, out flies a butterfly. Now, if you're not poisonous, and this pupae is not poisonous in the slightest, you are highly vulnerable to being eaten by predators because you ain't got no defense. You're just hanging there attached to a limb. So there's a coevolutionary struggle that is told in this morphology here, because the reason why these scales evolved, the reason why this pattern evolved that's so snake-like, is because it fooled birds and lizards into thinking that was a snake, and they're afraid of snakes. So the minute they spot the snake, They fly away, and the pupae survives. Now, if God had made all of them at one moment in time, he or she could have made the pupae exactly like the snake, one creation. No, we know that this mimic, as we call it, took millions of years to create through a constant coevolutionary struggle between deceiver and deceived. Sorry. Now, I'm just going to give you one other example of deception between species, and just because I find it very amusing, this looks like it might be another mimicking a predator, but no. Here you're mimicking the predator that you're fooling. So, here you can see the eyes of the creature. Here you can see its thorax. Here you can see its abdomen. Here you can see its front legs. And here you can see its antennae, right? Only that's nonsense. This is not a spider. There's a spider that looks exactly like it. This is a fly. And this is the abdomen of the fly. And these are fake eyes, eye spots. This is the thorax. And on the other side is the actual eyes of the fly and the actual antennae of the flies, but they're out of sight. The legs you see here, as you can see now, are just painted lines on the wings of this fly. Now, what happens is, when the fly sees a spider who preys on it, it turns and faces the spider. So there's a spider down here, and then it moves its wings up and down in such a way as to look like it's displaying aggressively. Because when these spiders fight each other, they show off like this. So it fools its predator into thinking it's a fellow predator. Fine. Now this is a very funny picture. You generally think of horses, I've always thought of horses as wanting to be mounted. So they want you to tie down a little seat on their back, and they wait there, and then you climb up, and then you gallop off, and the horse is happy. This is in China, and this horse ain't happy with this arrangement at all, as you'll see. He keeps falling over and acting dead. I didn't get on you yet, not yet. He's talking out loud. And already, he's just playing dead. Look at him. He looks deader than dead. And even his eyes, all right? It's cute but naughty. This is in China. Look at the damn dead horse. So, okay, this is a beautiful example of deception, again, between species, but using behavior. All right? This is just two pictures of him dead. Now, what is self-deception? Originally, I thought of it as follows, and I still think it's useful. You have true and false information about something simultaneously stored in your brain, but with a bias. You have the false information in your conscious mind, you have the true information in your unconscious mind. Now, you would think it was the other way around. Put the false information down in the basement somewhere out of sight, and keep the true information in the conscious mind so as to benefit from consciousness. whatever that benefit is. But instead, it's the other way around. And the reason, I believe, is because it's directed towards another individual who's watching you. So you want the other individual to see the falsehood and not to see the truth. So you hide the truth in the unconscious and try to fool him with a falsehood. Meanwhile, this individual evolves to try to look for cues of the truth that show up even though you're trying to suppress them. Is all self-deception this way? I used to think so. But no, there's recent research that's pretty unambiguous that in some species, when they look at a target, they immediately flash in the direction of the falsehood. And so there's no evidence that they ever store truth. They just store falsehood. But in general, this argument works pretty well. Now, here's one of the best examples. I'm going to give you two general categories of self-deception. One is that we have a tendency to put ourselves in the upper half of a distribution. So if you ask everybody here, are you in the top half for good looks? 70% of you are going to say yes. It ain't possible. It has to be 50%. High school seniors in the U.S., if you ask them, are you in the top half for leadership ability? 80% say yes. All right. Now, you cannot beat academics for self-deception. If you ask professors in the U.S., 94% say they're in the top half. Now, I plead guilty because I can be tied down to a bed in the back ward of a mental hospital, and I still think I'm doing better than half my colleagues. And that's not just a comment on my colleagues, okay? So this is the best experimental work, and it was done some time ago, as you can see, by Epley and Whitchurch. And Epley is the man, the professor, and his graduate student is Whitchurch. They've shaved off her hair, so to speak, from the photo, and they've done the same thing for him. Then they have morphed her in the direction of a very attractive female who's the average of attractive females picked out from a sample of 60, the top 8, let's say. And so here's her actual self. Here's 20% with her. Here's half and half. This is half her and half her. Now they also morph her in the opposite direction, and they do that by morphing her to someone with what's called cranial facial syndrome. That's where your face is sort of distorted. So you look uglier, okay? So here she's 20% better looking, here she's 20% uglier. Now, Epley's not so good looking anyway, so you gotta kind of shift it a little bit in your mind. But here he's 20% better looking, and here he's 20% less attractive. Now comes the game. They play the game with you. So they've taken a photo of you, they've removed your hair, and they put you in a sample of 12 photos, one of which is you. The other 11 are matched for your age and sex. And you've got a simple task. Suddenly, there are 12 faces in front of you on a screen, and with your right hand, you gotta hit this button as soon as you spot yourself. And then with this hand, you point to yourself. That corrects for errors. It also gives you something to do with each hand. And they want it automatic. They don't want you thinking about it. They tell you, look, as soon as you spot yourself, hit that. and hit that. So then the question is, which one do they see first? Because they're going to run 3 experiments on you. Real face, 11 other faces. 20% better looking, 11 other faces. 20% uglier, 11 other faces. Which one do you see first? I used to like to play this game with neurophysiologists back in, say, 2010 or whatever, and they believed in reality, and they believed the nervous system evolved to apprehend reality. So in general, they said, you're going to see the real face first. Well, no. You see the better looking face first, 1.86 seconds to hit that button, 5% longer to see the real face, and 5% longer still to see the 20% uglier face. So you have a bias towards seeing yourself as being better looking, consistent with the bias of placing yourself in the top half, okay? Now, how does that work in real life? I think if I walk into a room and I think I'm good looking, well, I walk in and I smile, you know. I think I project some of that self-image of being good looking. So it increases your sense that I might be good looking. Okay. They did other work, which I'm just going to spare you of the details, I think. Yeah. The other work is they would show you people, all 11 faces, not together, but separately in random order, and ask which one do you think is you? And sure enough, the one that is most frequently chosen is 20% better looking. 20% uglier is hardly chosen as real you at all. Fine. Now, a second kind of self-deception is not just self-inflation, being overconfident, but coming up with a facial expression that's very hard to fake. And the Duchenne smile seems to be beyond conscious, deliberate, or voluntary control. In other words, it's hard to fake. And the Duchenne smile is an example, and this is an example of what is being called Duchenne laughter. All right, here we've got it. So, we've got a normal face of a woman who is not smiling, but she's not grim. She's pleasant enough. Here, she's kind of smiling, but here's the real, genuine laughter. And you can see one effect is her eyes are half as big. So you tend to, concentrate on the lips, but no, you got to pay attention to the eyes to get the real, genuine one, and that'll produce crinkles around it, by the way, whereas this won't. And then you can see her her smile is much greater. They often show this tissue above the teeth, and it's wider and so on. So this one is very hard to fake. Now, we have in the room today a man named Robert Lynch, who was a student of mine some years ago, and then he ended up finally working with Virpi Luma down at Turku. And he did an extraordinary work. He was a stand-up comedian in his spare time, and he mastered the whole literature on facial expressions so that he could score them. And what he would do was show a set of people the same 4-minute clip from a comedy show, and then he would score every damn picture, and I don't know how many it was, 16 or something per second. How many was it, Robert?
I think it's like 28 per second. Yeah.
28 per second. Hold your hand up, Robert. That's Robert Lynch, okay? So, here's one result that he was even kind enough to add me as a co-author, simply because I had been his advisor. But what he did was to correlate the Duchenne, whoops, now I'm screwing up. Jesus Christ, okay, good. Yeah, I meant to just point here. So here he's measured the length of the genuine smile and the intensity of it. And this is a measure of self-deception. And that's based on a certain kind of questionnaire out of social psychology. It's a hell of a lot less precise than Robert's measures of the face are, but it's good enough. It'll work, and there's other studies that show, yes, it'll give you an approximate measure of self-deception. And what you see is that the more self-deception you are practicing, the less and less you are able to produce a Duchenne smile or laughter. So this is a way of detecting the self-deception, if you will. Now, one reason why I'm happy he added me as a co-author is that Donald Trump, whom we're going to come to, has only been seen to genuinely laugh once, and that was when a dog happened to run across the stage during one of his rallies, and the whole crowd burst out laughing, and he did too. So they have been citing Lynch and Trivers, and I don't know, there's some service where I get it and they say, you've been cited again. I say, what the hell is that? Oh, it's Robert Lynch they're citing. So anyway, thank you, Robert. We're going to come back to Trump. Trust me. Whether you want to or not. Okay. Now, let me give you one example of, so, wait a second now. Yeah, okay. So now let me give you one example of self-knowledge which is beneficial. And this has to do with an unusual measure, which is interoceptive accuracy, score on heartbeat counting task. So here they simply ask you, what is your guess as to what your heartbeat is? You know, is it 80 per second or whatever the hell the measure is, 80 per minute? Is it 100? Is it 60? So you got to guess it. And what you find is that traders, and I forget whether this was done in England on their stock exchange or as I think in the US, you find if you do it with controls, just regular people, that traders who trade stocks, they're better at interoceptive accuracy than our controls. And then, if you look at a subsample of 17 traders, where you also have the traders rank ordered, with one being the most profitable and 17 down here being the least profitable, you can see that there's a very strong correlation with their ability to detect their own heartbeat. If they're up there towards 90% accuracy, they're the top trader. If they're down here at 50-50, they're one of the worst traders. Okay? Now, okay. Now I want to give you evidence from a second study. And again, they start out with a very simple task. They simply say, write E on your forehead. And they want you to do it quickly. They give you a felt pen to write it. Now, another focused E is where I write the E like this. And you see it as an E. That's what he's done. A self-focused E, this guy looks a little bit less happy. A self-focused E is if I write the E like this, and as I look through it, I see an E, but you see the thing backwards, okay? Now then, they have a power manipulation, and this is artificial, but they either make you feel powerful or powerless. And it has a couple of components to it, but I don't have time to bore you with the details. The manipulation only lasts maybe a half a minute at the most, or even less. But they do the correlation right away, the behavior they're going to correlate with it. So if it only lasts for 10 seconds, that's long enough for them to find a relationship. And it'll last more like a half a minute. So in any case, what do they find out? If you're made to feel powerful, high power, then you write the self-focused E more often, as if you're more self-focused. With low power, you do the self-focused E, 12% of the time or whatnot. So you're more apt to do the other focused E. Now, there are other correlates that are very important. So, correlates of a sense of power. We just said, let me see if I've got this. Yeah, we just said self-focus. You're overconfident. And now, less ability to recognize facial expressions. So they show the people different facial expressions. Disgust, happiness, sadness, whatever, anger. And those that have been made to feel powerful, remember, it's a random set of people, they have less ability to recognize facial expressions. And they have less ability to remember faces. Now, in that case, they show them 10 faces and ask them to look at them for a while, and then they take them away and they do some other stuff, and then they come back and show them 20 faces, within which are embedded the 10 faces. And they got to pick out the ones that they've seen already. So once again, you see there's less ability to remember faces, the more powerful you feel. So power is taking you away from reality. Powerless is keeping you focused on reality. And that makes an obvious intuitive sense. If you're powerful, you can get away with stuff just because you're powerful. But if you're powerful over me and I'm powerless, I better study what the hell you're doing to protect myself. So I've got to remember faces. I've got to recognize facial expressions. I've got to be more reality oriented. Being overconfident is not going to pay, etc. So I think that's a very interesting and general finding. Now, people have sometimes asked me, what about cross-cultural data? These are the only cross-cultural data I know, and forgive me if your German is even weaker than your English, but this was prepared for a talk I gave in Germany. Selbstbetrug, that's self-deception, that's itsepetos in different countries as a function of the Gini coefficient, which is economic inequality. So a low Gini coefficient means that there's a lot of economic equality, but whereas if you get to a high Gini coefficient, you're at South Africa or Peru or even Venezuela, where there's a huge difference between the wealthy and the poor. The U.S., whoops, oh God damn it. I gotta watch this thing here. The U.S. is right in the middle, but this was done, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago. The U.S. has certainly climbed up here in terms of inequality. Now here is Selbstüberraschung. So this is self-inflation. How much do you overrate yourself? And I think it's an average of several traits. But what you see is that in countries like Japan and Germany, where there's not that much of a difference in salary between the boss and the workers, you also don't have much self-inflation. But the bigger the difference in economic gain, the more you're trying to inflate yourself, presumably to get some of that economic gain. Now I want to go inside ourselves for a moment. My original work was kindly referred to by Dr. Anna as social behavior, social theory between individuals. But then, second half of my intellectual life, I spent 12 years mastering all genetic conflict within ourselves. Truly selfish genes that replicate to our disadvantage. We'd rather they didn't, but they are happy to replicate because it increases their frequency. All right, it turns out that we have a paternal and a maternal self inside ourselves, and this is because in the late 80s they discovered that genes, there were some genes that acted differently depending on which parent donated a gene to you. We didn't know that or suspect that at all. Ever since Mendel's work was rediscovered and we built up genetics, we always assumed, well, it's a certain number of base pairs in a certain order, and it's identical, whether it comes from mom or dad, so it expresses itself identically. No, there are paternally active genes where only the paternal copy is active. The maternal copy is silent. So you would expect a paternally active gene to be selected to benefit dad and his relatives, dad and his cousins. You would expect a maternally active gene, and they're roughly equally numerous, where the maternal copy is active and the paternal copy is silent, to favor mom and her relatives. Now, the only overlap is full siblings, because they're equally related to both parents. There is no internal conflict. Mom and dad see it the same way. But for half-siblings, no. You're related to the half-sibling through one parent, but not through the other. And cousins, are typically unrelated unless your parents are related. Her cousins are different from his cousins. So you may even have a maternal self and a paternal self in you, which are unrelated, and they can be in conflict, precisely because you're weighting different relatives positively. And they may be selected to deceive each other. So that's a kind of self-deception that's not oriented towards fooling someone else. It's a self-deception inside yourself between two parts of yourself. Now, the person that came up with all this is named David Haig, H-A-I-G, and he's at Harvard. He has my old job there, and he's brilliant as an evolutionary geneticist. And he's also stone crazy about his own ideas. So one day I'm talking to him, and he says, yes, Mildred. Well, my name isn't Mildred, but he knows me well enough to know that my mother's name is Mildred, and my father's name is Howard. So that's my maternal self talking, you know. So it just blew me away. I almost fell off my chair. And I thought, Jesus Christ, is he walking around and seeing two people instead of one all the time? Because it's the maternal and the paternal self. Who knows? I don't want to find out. Now, just a couple of examples of nonsense, power of ideas that don't make sense. And I've taken these examples from the U.S. Where should the U.S. put solar panels? You know? Florida or Washington State? Florida is famous for its sunshine. People up north in Boston and New York and so on, if they've got enough money, they ship their car down to Florida middle of December, and they ship it back middle of March. And then they fly down there and live in their winter home, let's say, in Florida. Enjoy the sun, enjoy swimming, blah, blah, blah. Washington State is up here in the north. Florida's down here in the south. Is up there in the north right before you get to Vancouver, right before you get to Canada. And it's famous for overcast, rain, and so on. It's famous for Microsoft and a few other things, but it ain't famous for sunshine. Now, where should the U.S. put solar panels? And I say, no, you got that wrong. If you thought they put them in Florida, you got that wrong. Solar panels have been made illegal in Florida. So I went out to Washington to lecture to pharmacists, the annual meeting of the Pharmacists Association, and that was a lot of fun because the guy inviting me helped me sort out the deceit and self-deception going on in the pharmacy industry, which is pretty dreadful in the U.S. We pay 20% of our gross national product goes to health care. You don't see that in Europe. Europeans aren't that stupid. In any case, so I go out there and I was stunned. Every single light post as you drove along a street had a solar panel on it. And if you looked at houses, this was, God knows, upper middle class neighborhoods, there were big solar panels on the slanting roofs. So, solar panels everywhere. Well, you know, it may be overcast or not, you still got plenty of sun coming through. And so they are saving energy and doing just what we all know we should be doing given this climate crisis. Now, in Florida, the electrical company makes a lot of money by charging rates for the electricity they're supplying. People use a lot of electricity down there. They may have swimming pools. They may have other things that are electro-intensive. Plus, they've got people coming down, as I say, flooding the goddamn state in the winter months, and they're turning on their electrical outlets and so on. So, what the electrical companies did was they got their people that work with the legislators to try to manipulate them. They got them to pass a law outlawing solar panels. It's illegal to use it, to put up a solar panel in Florida. And they come up with some bogus argument about how if people plugged into the regular electrical grid, it would explode, or some kind of utter nonsense like that. But you don't need much if you're laying on money and bribing the legislature, so to speak. You don't need much in the way of logic or facts. So in any case, let me give you one or two other quick examples and be done with it. Wait a second. Here. Surviving an airplane ride. Do you prefer pilot or co-pilot flying, and why? Now, we know statistically that roughly 50% of the time the pilot flies and roughly 50% co-pilot. And by flying, I'm referring to who takes off and who lands. The intermediate flight may be shared between the two of them. It may be run by machines. You know, you're up there at 35,000 feet. You just got to make sure that you don't bump into anything. But who would you prefer to have flying the airplane? Well, most people say pilot. They're older, they're more experienced, and they've been promoted to be a pilot. None of which is true to co-pilots. No. 80% of accidents occur with a pilot flying. Why is that? Because when the co-pilot flies, the pilot is acting as a co-pilot, but he's still in charge of the airplane. He can still take it over. When Sully Sullenberger famously landed an airplane in the Hudson River in New York City, when it took off and ran into a flock of birds and knocked out both the engines, the co-pilot was flying, and Sullenberger, who was an outstanding pilot, said, "My airplane." And the co-pilot said, "Your airplane." At that point, Sullenberger is flying the airplane. And not a life was lost. But in any case, what we believe is that the co-pilot is weaker than the pilot in the co-pilot role, because the pilot is more dominant. What is the worst, what is the most dangerous combination? The most dangerous combination is where the pilot and co-pilot are flying for the first time, and the pilot is flying. And why is that the most dangerous? Well, we think it's because if I'm a co-pilot and you're a pilot, and we've flown 4 times already, we've shared personal information. I know you have 4 children, and you know I have 2. I know you like to play golf, and I like to play tennis, or whatever. And that friendship that's built up through contact means I'm more likely to speak up when you're messing up and save us. Authoritarian versus egalitarian cockpits. Korean Airlines were famous for having a very authoritarian cockpit. And that's partly a function of their language, which is rank ordered. And, but just to give you an example, once a pilot backhanded a co-pilot, well, slapped him in his face. That's not a gesture that's going to encourage a co-pilot to speak up again. And then there's a famous story somewhere out in Indonesia or something like that, not too damn far from Korea, where they're in danger of flying into a mountain, and the co-pilot is saying, "Papa-san, I think maybe you should, he's talking slowly and politely, boom, they're dead. They were so bad that, and I don't know which country did it, one country, the US, refused to allow them to land in the United States, and the other one, Canada, refused to allow them to fly over. Or I think it was probably the other way around. The US refused to allow them to fly over the country, and Canada wouldn't allow them to land. So they had to, they had to rework their whole pilot, co-pilot system, and they had to make it more egalitarian, and they had to rely more on English so as not to be trapped by the authoritarian language of Korean. As you know, Boeing's 737 MAX, they had 2 crashes, and 347 people were dead in the space of less than 6 months. 2 crashes. After the fact, there was a repeated denial by Boeing that there was anything wrong with the 347 MAX, but countries, and it was not initially grounded in the US. Boeing is a US company, but it was grounded by other countries, and then the US joined in, and all models are still grounded. It's well over a year that they've been grounded. Now, what was the problem? The problem was that they had designed a lower slung version of the 737. This was the 737 MAX, which was more powerful. And the only problem was that the pilot would have to pay close attention to whether he or she was flying too much up this way, in which case with the speed, you could go up so if you're more than 20% angle. And in that case, you fly straight the hell up, slow down, turn around, fly straight the hell down into the ground. And you cannot regain a horizontal position as you're coming down. So they set up an automatic system in which there was an automatic override, but they did it very, very poorly. There was no redundancy in their powerful system with multiple automatic overrides. No redundancy in automatic system. That meant if there was an error, a signal that was in error, which there was no second version of the signal where you would look and say, wait, one signal says we're only climbing at 5%, the other says 25%. So, then you deal with that. No, they only had one reading. And it was just such a powerful system because once it kicked in, it forced your plane down, and there wasn't anything you could really do about it. Sully Sullenberger, maybe 6 months after the grounding, they put him in one of these artificial cockpits and simulated a 737 in a crisis. And he came out of there shaking and saying it's almost impossible to deal with. Because Boeing was saying, oh, it's because the pilots aren't trained, but they specifically didn't involve them in training to begin with, because they were profit motive. They wanted to grind out more and more airplanes. Well, thank God they've taken a $15, $20, $30 billion hit, and their stock has taken a huge hit. All right. Self-deception and immunology. Let's get through this quickly, and let me see what time it is. It's a bit after 3. Okay. Now, first of all, let me just tell you one thing about the immune system. It is extremely expensive. Every 2 weeks, you produce 2 grapefruit-sized sets of tissues right here, or well, wherever you produce them, but that's the size of them. And that's every 2 weeks. Then the white blood cells have to be replaced. So these are all white blood cells, not red blood cells. And so it's not a half-life, it's a full life. At the end of 2 weeks, you got to replace all of them. So it's an extremely expensive system. Now, a brilliant social psychologist by the name of James Pennebaker at the University of Texas, he was doing something separate initially, in which he showed that sharing trauma is beneficial. So what he wanted was people sharing for the first time a trauma that they hadn't shared with other people. They're adults. Now, what are the most traumatic events? Well, sexual molestation, when you're a child, is the most traumatic. Next to that is death of a parent. Divorce of your parents can be highly traumatic, etc. So in any case, he would get these people in the lab and he would say, do you have something traumatic that you haven't shared? And they would say yes. And he would say, all right, you're going to write for a half an hour, 3 successive days, maybe 20 minutes, on the trauma. Nobody's going to read it. This is a private journal you keep. You write it down, you leave with it, you come back with it, so we can't read it. So you're just sharing it with yourself, really, at that point. You're being open about it. And here's what he found, which was very interesting. He also took an immune assay, and he discovered that your immune system started to strengthen immediately. After 3 days, it starts rising, and it gets stronger and stronger. 3 months later, it's still raised. Now, your mood goes in the opposite direction because you're sharing something that's painful. So you're thinking about something that's painful. So your mood goes downhill while your immune system goes uphill. Then this thing shifts, and after 3 months, your mood is elevated above the 1-to-1 line, just as your immune system is. So sharing trauma is beneficial. He then produced, there's a whole literature, there's studies, where, if you have 10 or 15 studies, you do a meta-analysis of them and so forth and so on. So in any case, sharing trauma is beneficial. Suppressing truth is costly. And I say in the closet, which I'll come to in a moment. That's a phrase we use, I don't know whether you use it in Finland, for homosexual men who are hiding their homosexuality. The more they hide it, the more they're said to be in the closet, okay? And there are degrees of being out of the closet. You can start out where you don't share it with anybody except a couple of homosexual friends. Then you share it with your close friends. Then you share it with your family and your close friends. And go on out till whoop-de-doo! Everybody knows you're gay, even if you haven't shared it with them. So we'll come to the suppressing truth. Meditation can improve immune function, and music is good too. And it depends on the music. Elevator music is especially good because it's designed to calm yourself in a situation where you might be frightened. You're in, a box that's moving up and down. So Beethoven and Bach and classical music That'll raise your immune response by 20%. Jazz by 8%, because jazz is a little bit more, a little bit less melodic. Zero is zero, and then cacophony, where you're just making random sounds, that'll take your immune system down by about 8%. All right, fine. Now, let's turn to this problem of homosexuality. Here's a very interesting study that was done on A1 heterosexual males, according to Kinsey criterion. What's an A1 heterosexual male? Never had a homosexual experience, never had a homosexual fantasy, never even had a homosexual thought, or so they say. Now, you then divide them into those that are very hostile towards homosexuals and those that are relaxed. Now, they use the word homophobic, but that's a misnomer. That's fear of homosexuality, and that's coupled with the notion that you're only aggressive about things you're fearful about, which is not true. So really, it's aggression. So the aggressive ones, they get angry if they see two men holding hands. God forbid they should see two kissing, Whereas the relaxed ones, they're just relaxed. I remember when I was 22, and, I heard someone was gay, and I said, great, one less man is one more woman. No problem with it at all. All right, fine. So we've got them separated now, and now we have some fun. Now we show them dirty movies, i.e. pornography, and here's a man and a woman making love, and we've tied a plethysmograph around the base of each man's dick, and that measures circumference very precisely. So that's what we're measuring here, is the size of your erection. Okay? So you start off, both the groups, the dick grows admirably, continues to grow. By God, after 6 minutes, it looks like it's still straining to get 1 more millimeter of size. All right, fine. There's no difference statistically between these two lines. They're identical. Here, you're watching two women make love, and you start out aroused, and then for certain reasons, it tapers off compared to a man and a woman. Again, there's no statistical difference between the two, so I won't tell you who's who. Now, you're probably guessing what's happening down here. This is two men getting it on. These are the relaxed men. They show a small and statistically insignificant increase in tumescence over 6 minutes. So that's not significantly different than that down here, right? Now let's look at the homophobic or hostile to homosexual men. They start rising here. Whoa, they take off here. The dick is getting larger and larger and larger and larger. It's 2/3 of the way up to watching two women. Now you also ask the men, were you aroused? And in 5 out of 6 cases, the level of arousal that people admitted to matches the penis size. The only one that doesn't is this one, because they deny any arousal, and yet they clearly showed arousal. All right? So that gets us to gay men effects of being in the closet. If you're HIV positive, you die 20% sooner if you're in the closet. They divide men into halfway in the closet and halfway, out, and divide it that way. Now, I'll come back to this condom use in a second. If you're HIV negative and you're in the closet, you die more often from cancer and you suffer more bronchitis. So cancer is one extreme, very bad. Bronchitis is minor, but they both show the same correlation. The effect of being in the closet is negative. It's better for you to be out of the closet. Now, this has been intensively studied, of course, and that's partly why we have data on gay men. And my concern with this correlation, there were two studies that showed a strong effect, was that I figured that men that were in the closet were less likely to use condoms and therefore more likely to be multiply infected. And if you're multiply infected, the different HIV strains compete with each other and you're apt to get AIDS that much sooner. Why did I think there was this difference in condom use? Because let's say I'm gay and I've got, a heterosexual couple here and a heterosexual couple here, and we all decide to go out to dinner. So 5 of us are going to go out to dinner. Now, I'm not planning to do anything with gay men, but I have 3 drinks, and on the way home, I turn left instead of turning right, and I go into homosexuality land for a while, and then return home. Now, if I'm out of the closet, I've got 2 condoms in my wallet and 5 in my socks in case there's an orgy. So I'm ready. And I'll be using condoms more often. By God, out came the 3rd study, and they corrected for condom use. And sure enough, it showed just the correlation I imagined. It was just barely significant that you use condoms more often if you were out of the closet. But when you corrected for that, it had a trivial effect. It was still true that being in the closet made you die of HIV that much sooner. The optimism hoax is just nonsense about optimism is good in life because it promotes survival and well-being. But you'd expect if you were in good health to be more optimistic. So if you find out that you survive better for the next 2 years because you were optimistic, one hypothesis is optimism benefited itself. The other is simply it's just a correlation. So I write the woman, and I said, very interesting paper you just published, but it's just a correlation. So isn't it possible that the logic goes the other way around? And you can just hear her drawing up in front of her desk, and she writes me and she says, we've been working on this topic for 22 years. So the form of the argument is, we've had it wrong for 22 years, and by God, we're going to keep it up, Anyway, so that's the optimism hoax. And it isn't even true, or completely. Here's survival as a function of pessimism. This is, God knows men, I don't know whether it's women also, it's people over 60, and this is in Germany, so it might be true of Germans and not Finns, I don't know. But this says you survive better if you're pessimistic. Now, maybe if you're pessimistic, you look after your health more, You do push-ups at night. I don't know why, and I don't really care. Let's end on this duppy, as they would call him in Jamaica, ghost. That's Donald Trump. Now, Some people call him a narcissistic sociopath. I call him a psychopath for the sake of this because there's a scientific literature on psychopaths. There's no scientific literature on narcissistic sociopaths. There's a psychopathic scale, which you can take a test which shows how psychopathic you are. Now, most psychopaths are nonviolent. They don't kill or hurt. They are arrested more often than non-psychopaths, but for the same crime or the same charge, they spend less time in jail. So they're able to talk their way or manipulate their way out of it. So, what's their key character? They're smart, they are very good deceivers, and they concentrate on that. They are very good at detectors of deception, and then they are said to have no conscience. And this I don't like. That means they're defective, because we know a conscience has evolved by logic, over several million years. So it's advantageous to have a conscience. However, if they're defective, then they're like a negative mutation that's just cleaned out every time it appears, right? So they shouldn't rise in frequency, they shouldn't evolve. What I want to argue, as you'll see in another slide or two, is that Donald Trump is a highly evolved organism. Okay? So this is the same mistake they made with homosexuality. If you go back about 20 years, and I just haven't had the time to do it, you will find in the, whatever the doctor's manual that they use for disorders, that homosexuality is a disorder, a defect, maybe an unresolved Oedipal complex or God knows what. Well, then, homosexuality came out of the closet and they became more active and so on. So they had to change it. And so they've changed the way they referred to it. And now they don't make it into a defect. And they shouldn't. It's 3% frequency in a number of societies in men. And we know of two genes, two locations where there are genes, XQ28 and the 8th chromosome, which are associated with a chance of being homosexual. So getting back to psychopaths, no, they're not a defect. They are a stable minority at about a 1% frequency. And it turns out that when you look at psychopaths, they have the same reproductive success as a non-psychopath. So they're not suffering a cost in terms of reproduction. But the stable minority of about 1% frequency implies that there's an advantage at low frequencies when you get below 1. And if you get above 1, you start getting a disadvantage kicking in, which is presumably feedback from other people because you're acting psychopathic. Now, there's a striking kinship correlation, and this was published by some Canadian mathematicians back in 2012, and it blew me away because it meant natural selection had been working on them. Namely, there's a greater tendency to be psychopathic with lower relatedness to the victim. I'll show you that slide in a second. And likewise, if you measure dispersal from where they're born to where they settle down as an adult and act psychopathic, there's greater distance dispersed by more psychopathic individuals, as if they're getting away from related individuals so as not to harm their themselves genetically. And this whole correlation with relatedness to the victim, we're no longer talking about equal reproductive success. We're no longer talking about that. We're talking about a kinship effect. So that's evidence of selection, and very striking. Now, this is the evidence that I just referred to. And here you've got dispersal as a function of the rank on the psychopathic scale. And this is the distance dispersed. So the more psychopathic they are, the more they've dispersed. This shows that if they're interacting with a first degree cousin, they're less psychopathic. Second degree, they're more psychopathic. Unrelated, highly psychopathic. Okay, fine. Now let's give one last one on Trump, and then let's just run through a bunch of slides of him. First of all, he has 5 children. He invests heavily in them. Ivanka's husband, Jared Kushner, Donald Jr. He may even love them, okay? But less related, he's a stone racist. Of Mexicans, he says they're rapists and murderers. This is because he wants to build a wall. But in actual fact, we have facts on both rape and murder by immigrants, illegal immigrants from Mexico, and it's lower than it is for American citizens. So he's got it in the wrong direction. He's especially hostile towards black people. Haiti and 2 African countries, he called them shithole countries. Well, you know, if you're gonna mix shit with being black, you ain't complimenting them, and it's nasty. He also hates Barack Obama, and initially he was a so-called birther. That is, starting in 2000 whatever, 2010 for about 3 years or something, he was arguing that Obama was not born in Hawaii, so he wasn't born in the U.S., so he's not a U.S. citizen, so he cannot be president. Indeed, to be president, you have to be born in the U.S., i.e. you have to have been a citizen from birth. And he has tried to upend every single thing that Obama passed, he's tried to reverse. My joke is that if it was Africans trying to come in from Mexico, he'd be using napalm, you know. Now, in terms of deception, there are actual newspapers that keep a tally, and he's over 1,600 major lies in 3 years. If he has a good weekend, there's 20 or 30 or 40 more lies. He thinks nothing of them. And finally, he can reverse himself, and frequently does, often 180 degrees, fly back in the opposite direction. So you see, as a psychopath, at a 1% frequency, every time his gene appears, and it's probably heterozygote advantage, so it's 1 psychopath gene and 1 normal gene, every time that happens, that individual is under strong selection. So they're going to evolve. They're going to evolve to be more deceitful, more skillful at it, etc., etc. But the rest of us, if the rest of us are not psychopathic, we're only running into the guy every now and again. The only difference about Trump is that he's world famous. the whole country knows him now. So it's more than 100 people that may be turning against him. I pray to Jesus every night that it'll be sufficient to get rid of him this coming November. Because he's been dreadful so far, and if we give him 4 more years, my God. Ivanka, by the way, thinks that she's going to run in 2024. I'll move to Finland and start learning how to speak your language. So, let's just roll now with his character. Just look at his goddamn face. If you see anything pleasant there, tell me.
What's the time?
Someone saw something pleasant? All right. There, he's pretty self-satisfied, isn't he? And look how he's got his hair combed and so on. Now, what the hell he's doing here, I don't know. This is my favorite picture of him. But I keep asking people, and they say that they've seen that gesture of his, but we can't quite remember, you know, what situation he's using it in. Here, it's sort of like, what, me? You know, why are you pointing a finger at me? Something like that. Now, he's looking across at somebody in the cabinet meeting, and there was one time where a 4-star general, that's as high as you can get in the U.S. Army, 4-star general, was his national security advisor. And he says to Trump, you should hire bright people. You should hire smart people, which of course is obvious, for Christ's sake. And there's a pause, and he says, I'm the smartest person in the world. And he seems to believe it. One thing he doesn't do is change positions which are manifestly false and people are nailing him on. He sort of grips them. So he's looking across at someone, and he ain't going to treat them nice. There he is. All right, this is the second to last slide of him. Over here, this of course is not him, but it is, he tweeted it, okay? So he had his face glued onto an athlete's body, dressed in as a boxer. This is what he actually looked like at the time. You know, look at that gut over here. And now, the most famous recent picture is the one that proves that he's painting on his face, because the wind was blowing that day, and normally, as you see, he combs his hair so it covers all of this. And then he's painted on this. People analyze him. Could it be a tanning machine? No, it couldn't be. Could it be a tanning lotion? Well, there's some lotions that act as if, you got it through the sun. But in any case, it's very, very clear that the guy paints his face. All right. So much for pathos, pathos in the United States and in the government at large. Deceit and self-deception has grown to an immense topic. It's like the zeitgeist. I mean, political scientists have discovered it recently. So it outpours journal articles, and they discover it as if they're the first to discover it, because you know how you do, you leaf through and you say, is there any citation of Trivers? No, there isn't. So I'm a little bit disappointed, but I don't really care. The subject is just taken over or spreading. Economics, no. Economics has still got an enormous amount of self-deception in it, but they ain't anywhere near a theory of it. It's something that all of us can study in our own lives. The logic is pretty simple, and it can give us deeper insight into our relations with other people and ourselves. And I thank you very warmly for your attention.
Thank you so much, Robert. And we have time until 4 for those who can stay. And it would be nice to have, I'm sure there are many questions and reactions or comments. Yes, please.
So thanks a lot for this very entertaining and informative talk. I had a question about this first, in the beginning of the slides, you showed those pictures where people were being more attracted as attractive.
Sorry, say that again?
Yes, I'll say.
Oh, thank you.
Can I just speak more?
Yes, I just want to tell you this ear is entirely for decoration. It doesn't work anymore. So I'll come over here and try to shine my left ear on you. But yeah, you talk.
Okay, so in the beginning of your talk,
Yes.
you showed those pictures of two people that were made more attractive
Yes.
and less attractive.
Yes.
And then you also showed that that if a person is asked, or they would first see their
Yes.
attractive picture. But I was wondering if someone is in depression or someone was made more powerful, as you showed in latest things, they would still do it that way. Is there a study? They would still pick the one that is more attractive of them, or they would maybe evaluate them first.
Well, that's a very good question. In actual fact, depression has been shown to make people much more accurate. It reduces the amount of self-inflation and so on. So that's a very good point. Now also, I know of one paper, and I couldn't find it. I wanted to, before I set loose from Jamaica to come on this trip. And it showed it was a matter of women's view of themselves, and they went from good looking to less and less good looking. And what was the result now? Oh, yes. At a certain point, they started rating themselves as uglier than they were. In other words, here they're going downhill from being good looking to being ugly. And here's the curve where they're overrating themselves, and it's approaching here, and then down at the bottom quarter or something across here, it actually goes underneath, and now they're underrating themselves. And I don't know about you, but I always used to find, if I met a woman, and these were women in their 20s, let's say this is, 28, 22, those kind of days of your life, who I realized had a low self-image, it turned me off real quick. And I used to say to myself, I've only known her for a month. She's known herself for 28 years, and she thinks she's ugly or, unattractive. So I'm going to go with her because she's got more experience. But anyway, it's a good question.
Yes, please. Other questions? Cielo. Yes. Toimiiko se? So Christian is helping, but we have... Unfortunately, this mic is not working, although it should be. This one is good.
I can always walk up there if you want.
I'm sorry, I'm really sorry about this. Hei, toimiks toi, joka on siellä?
I'm gonna.
Sorry for those who are watching this on stream. Antti.
Well,
pitäisikö kysyä?
I'll repeat it if I hear it. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. So I was wondering that while Trump is lying all the time and he's a kind of psychopath, and I also think that almost everybody in this audience dislikes him. So why is he so liked also in America? So why people don't see or dislike the deception by him? How do you explain that? Why doesn't he discuss everybody? These pictures, like we can laugh at them, but why some people think that, okay, that's just great.
Yes, this lady has just asked, I don't know whether you heard, why isn't the great majority of Americans, or all Americans, regard him as a liar and someone not to support? Why does he have 40% of the country behind him?
Yeah.
Which is roughly what he does.
Yeah.
Now, it fluctuates a bit, and when it goes down to 38%, we're happy, and when it jumps up to 45, we get even more scared. I talk to people who say they're virtually certain that he's going to be reelected. And, you know, I say I'm going to jump off a cliff. I can't take it, you know, or something like that. I do not know. Make America Great Again. The MAGA hats, Make America Great Again. He's appealing to white, older, white, working class people. And they feel like they're being left behind. And they feel that the immigrants are doing better than them. And God knows there are a bunch of immigrants that are. The country is a country made of immigrants. It used to be the case that 10% of Americans every generation were born outside of the U.S. We have a large Iranian American population in Los Angeles. You know, escaped the Shah or then escaped the mullahs afterwards and so on. The Mexicans that do come across the border, they ain't rapists and murderers. And by the way, he'll get an anecdote of each. He'll be giving a talk and he'll say, for example, there was recently Jose Ramos that raped 2 women and then murdered a third person in California. And that's just an anecdote, you know.
Sorry, I will. Robert, would you like to have one more question, because that's all we have time for?
What's that?
If you want to, we can have one more short question and a reply. Would that be
Well,
good to
thank you.
close with? Sorry, because I think
Yeah.
this that question will not be
okay.
so. Because I had a hand there. Yes, who had the last really short question? I saw a hand there, whom I promised to. Maybe that person already had to leave. Are you okay? There. So very short question, and then as a final treat.
Okay, so I'll
For
try
us.
to
Are we
give
getting
this.
close to the end? Is
Yes,
that what you're
yes.
saying?
This is the last question.
Yeah,
Yes.
and I will take
Oh,
too
there's-
damn long talking.
So much pressure. Yeah. So, do you think we can control our self-deception if somebody points out our deception to us? Can we be aware of it?
If someone points out our what?
Our self-deception to us, like points out that we are. You know.
Well, there's an interesting question about dealing with your own self-deception, and I have found that my own self-deception is very hard to change. I'm conscious of it and still unable to change it. I can give you two real quick examples. One, which I attribute to my father's harsh discipline, is that I look for things backwards. So if you can't find something, you should look first at the most likely place, then the second most likely, right down the line, because you'll find it quicker that way. I do it the other way around. I start with the least likely, and then the second least likely, and I go up. And the reason is, I think, if I'm heading down, I get more and more depressed because I get more and more afraid that I'm going to get down at the bottom and haven't found the damn thing. Now, if I start at the bottom, I'm hopeful because I'm going towards more likely. The only one that's really scary is the second to last one, because if that ain't there, and then I got to face, the fact that I don't know where the hell it is. So I have forced myself to change, but I literally have to grab myself by the collar and say, no, you're not walking over there, you're walking here. Here's the most likely. All right, I'll give you a second example real quickly. I have a spiteful side to myself where if you do something spiteful towards me, I want to reciprocate. It's not just reciprocal altruism with me, I'm afraid. It's a reciprocal spite. And a voice inside me will say, Bob, for 423 times you've decided to do this, and every time you've regretted it 5 minutes later, which is true, or pretty much true. And then a stronger voice comes and says, no, this time is different. And there we go with 426, So the damn thing repeats itself. Now, I was talking to a good friend of mine, a Jamaican-American friend, and I don't know how we got a subject on it. He said, what are you doing? I said, I'm about to leave a nasty message on this woman's answering machine. And he said, why are you doing that? Because she left a nasty message on mine. So it's a spite for spite. So he says, where's the benefit in that? That's in the past. You're not gaining anything. All she's going to do is leave yet a nastier one. So you're going in the wrong direction. And I realized he's right. And then I realized that friends can look at your life more objectively than you, and more objectively than your relatives. If my brother advises me, you have to be aware that he's half related to me. So there's a part of himself that's involved, If I'm doing something stupid like I did in the 80s in California and, tried that drug, he could come to me and he said, Bob, you're effing up. You're messing up your life. And I'm thereby messing up his inclusive fitness. But a friend cares for you as a friend, but they have no direct self-interest. If you destroy yourself, it hasn't harmed them at all. You know what I mean? So anyway, I don't have much more to say than that, dear.
Thank you.